Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Elaine Gazda, who will discuss her research project on archaeology, art, and politics in early 20th century America. And we're also going to talk about your book, The Ancient Art of Emulation, Studies in Artistic Originality and Tradition from the Present to Classical Antiquity, which was published for the American Academy in Rome by the University of Michigan Press. Welcome to Rip Rap, Elaine.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
That's one of the longest titles for a program I've ever had. And really, the fun part, I thought, was your new research on archaeology, art, and politics. But that really is a story about the Villa of Mysteries, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it's certainly closely related to the Villa of the Mysteries. It's a story really that involves the discovery of the Villa of the Mysteries, almost by accident, and on a property that was owned by someone named Aurelio Item outside the walls of the ancient city of Pompeii. And just as luck would have it, they discovered this marvelous set of wall paintings that was immediately claimed as the masterpiece, the greatest masterpiece that we'd had up to that time in ancient painting. So they became famous immediately, and in all the newspapers. The reason that I got involved in this project is that Professor Kelsey at the University of Michigan, he was a professor of Latin, but he also wanted to introduce his students to the material culture of the Romans, so he taught a good deal of archaeology. He had had a long-standing interest in Pompeii, and when these discoveries were made, or this discovery, he resolved at some point after 1909, when they were discovered, to have a replica made so that the replica could be exhibited in Ann Arbor, and it could serve as a study piece, something that scholars could come and look at and study the symbolism of, the artistic merits of, and also that the public could just enjoy. So it was not until the early 1920s, after the First World War, when he decided to hire an artist to do this. And he contacted a woman by the name of Esther Van Diemen, who had been one of his students at Michigan in the classics. She, after getting her degree here, went to Rome and lived there for most of the rest of her life, doing research on Roman construction. And she was particularly interested in the Vestal Virgins and studied their place of residence and their center, the center of their cult, so to speak, in the Roman Forum. So she knew the Roman Forum, and she became acquainted with a woman by the name of Maria Barroso, who was the artist, the chief draftsman for the Roman Forum excavations. And so Van Diemen put Kelsey in touch with Barroso, and he hired her then to make this replica, which was a huge job. And she had to get leave from her job at the Roman Forum. She went to Pompeii, and she spent on and off over a year and a half there in the room, which was not very well protected at the time. Now it's got a nice concrete vault over it and so forth, but at the time it was pretty much exposed to the elements, and she was working there day in and day out all this time until she finished. And by the time she finished, unfortunately, Professor Kelsey died. However, she did finish and sent the replica to the Kelsey Museum, and in 1927 she finished, and it arrived later that year. And essentially it remained rolled up and in storage at the Kelsey, where I am a curator. And so I took an interest in these things and began to explore just what the story was behind these watercolors, and what their importance was really for archaeology and for, at the time, the politics of Italy in the 1920s, when Mussolini was coming into his own.
Well, we should give some idea of how big this project was, because it wasn't just a wall painting, it was like an entire room?
That's right, it's an entire room, and Scholars debate all the time what the room was used for because of the interesting iconography and potentially quite powerful in its meaning. A lot of people, when they first discovered this room in the so-called Villa of the Mysteries, which, by the way, is named for this room because the wall paintings seem to represent a series of rituals in the mysteries of Dionysus, the god Dionysus, or Bacchus, as we more commonly call him. And in any event, this this room, we think now, was a dining room. Most scholars think was a dining room, not a place of celebration of the mysteries. But the wall paintings themselves show women engaged in a series of rituals of having a child read from a scroll, of preparing special food perhaps to offer to the god, of actually flagellating a woman, possibly in the interest of driving out impurities. And then one scene at the end of this cycle, if you walk around the room from left to right, the last scene shows a woman having her hair dressed and two little cupids flanking her on each side. And many people have said she is the bride, and that this whole thing is about the preparation of a bride, initiating her into the mysteries of this god, Dionysus or Bacchus, and then at the end of it, becoming the bride, not only in fact, in reality, but the bride of Dionysus as well. So it's very, I mean, I've given a very simplified version of the possible meaning of this cycle of paintings, but it's the commonly reported one. And because it also involves women and various secret rites that we'll never understand completely, because these rites were secret and they were never written down. So much of what we rely on is speculation, and that has created, of course, a lot of confusion in the study of these paintings, trying to figure out what they are, and there are many, many theories. But nonetheless, it's a powerful set of paintings, and it's just a magnet for scholars who just keep wanting to figure it out and figure out what is the key. In my own research, I feel that that takes us along the wrong path, that there probably isn't one key, that there probably are many meanings encoded into this series of paintings, and that we have to think about who was doing the viewing, and what kind of knowledge did they bring to that viewing. And
what was the interest? I mean, how did you get interested in these particularly?
Well, they're famous monuments, and my field is Roman art, and so as a teacher of Roman art, I always have something to say about them in courses that will cover Roman painting or anything about Pompeii. And I got particularly interested and got engaged in doing research because of these watercolors that are in the Kelsey Museum. And since I'm a curator, and because I felt a responsibility to study these and find out more about them, I slowly got engaged not only in the watercolors but in the monument that they represent, and trying to study the monument on its own, the watercolors on their own, but then also what the watercolors tell us about the monument, at least in the years when Maria Barroso was working in that room, what kind of condition they were in, what she saw that maybe we can't see any longer today.
Well, that was also the thing I got from the book, is that when you're dealing with antiquities, this is old stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And then you try to figure out, without distortion, or try to keep the distortion, but try to figure out the intent and the originality. I mean, and so it's kind of like a puzzle in a way, that you use these different tools. What kinds of things have you used to kind of try to decode what these paintings represented?
You mean the meaning of them?
Yeah, or their origin, and what's going on with them.
Oh gosh, that's a really complicated question. Well, it depends on what exactly you're trying to find out. If you're trying to figure out what the meaning of the images is, then you look at all sorts of other images that were produced in that same general time period, actually anywhere from the 3rd century BC up until the time that these were at least buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. And sometimes pottery is painted with similar images. Sometimes there are other paintings that are smaller but have a scene or two that are very similar to the...
So you do sort of a contextual...
A lot of comparisons, trying to figure out what you know about the object you're using as a comparison, and whether that can inform us about this unknown object or set of paintings. So that's one standard way of going about trying to decode. Literary sources, to whatever extent we have them, can sometimes inform us about what's going on. As I said a little while ago, though, unfortunately, the Dionysiac mysteries were never written down, so we're not going to have a textbook to read to tell us what was going on. And we also try to look into other cults, literature on other cults that might be informative. You look also to the social context. Who would have been an owner? What kind of person would have been an owner of this villa around the time that these paintings were made, and why would he or she have wanted to have these painted on the walls? And this is, we think, a set of paintings that was put on the walls shortly after Pompeii became a Roman colony. I mean, it had already been a city for several centuries, and before the Romans came and actually colonized it and established a formal government in the Roman format, the Samnites were the ruling population. And so we have to look into who was still in Pompeii. Would Samnites still have owned that villa, or would it have been a Roman who'd come into Pompeii in a new position of power? What would it have meant in either case? You can come up with lots of different possibilities for reading those images, or trying to see it from the perspective of Samnite religion or Roman religion or Greek religion, and or not even religion exclusively, but social practices, things like dining. Romans loved to have fancy dinner parties, and they frequently had elaborately decorated dining rooms. And not only did they have dining, but entertainment, and Dionysus is connected with the theater, and so this kind of imagery was appropriate, would have been appropriate for a dining room. It's very frustrating, though, because in many cases when we have a Roman dining room, the floor pattern will show us where the dining couches were placed, and in this room there's no pattern to indicate that. So we can't be 100% sure. Can't be 100% sure, and it's very tricky because the Romans used rooms for different things at different times of day, different seasons. So there might have been many functions. One of the major theories about the use of this room was that it was used for the preparation of a bride, or that it was used for the initiation rites of women into the cult of Dionysus. Well, we can't prove that it was or wasn't, but I suppose, the fact that the room wasn't going to be used for dining 24 hours a day and 7 days a week could have been used for something like that, but we don't.
Some kind of ceremonial purpose?
Yeah, some kind of ceremonial purpose. You just don't really know. So it's an endlessly fascinating and I think probably unresolvable problem to try to figure out.
So you kind of work out a fragment, or what fragments you have, and then there's a certain point where you can't go beyond that. That's as much evidence as you've got.
Yeah, exactly. You have to work within the limits of your evidence, and it's frustrating to have to stop when you think you're onto something, but if you don't have the evidence to back up your theories, well, then all you've got is a theory.
Well, one of the things that is pointed out in the book, and I think as you also are working with here, is that when you have someone interpret or restore, or another artist gets involved, there's another layer of interpretation going on there.
That's right.
And that was certainly true of this Maria, that it wasn't exactly the same thing that she saw in terms of what she painted.
Right, and that's what I'm finding out now. I'm making a very close comparison between Maria Barroso's replica and the paintings on the walls in Pompeii, and trying to see how she edited what she saw, or I mean, I can't be 100% sure that what we see today on the walls in Pompeii is what she saw. I mean, because the common practice at Pompeii for the preservation of these paintings and other paintings throughout the city was to coat them periodically with a mixture of gasoline and wax.
Oh my.
And I mean, it sounds just horrible, but it seems to have worked to a certain extent. But wax will darken, and I thought the colors probably had become more subdued as a result of this repeated treatment. There have been problems with water getting into the walls and staining the paintings. You don't see those stains so much on her replica, and I wonder whether she simply thought they were ugly and wouldn't paint them, or whether they weren't there in the 1920s when she painted this replica. So I'm trying to puzzle through that to see how she responded, but my current theory is that she had an idea about what they looked like when they were in their prime, and that she wanted somehow to bring out, she does say in her letters to Kelsey that she wants to capture the true beauty of these paintings. And so I think she did a certain amount of editing, and I'm still learning about where she did that and how she did that.
Well, maybe the purpose of taking something from Italy and then knowing that it was going to end up in the United States at a research institution, she might want to burnish that some to, for presentation.
Yeah, it's hard to say, because she had already for 20 years been professional draftsman at the Roman Forum, working side by side with archaeologists, and she herself kind of eased into becoming an archaeologist in her own right. And so she knew the value of very careful, what she would call scientific recording. So I know that she wanted to do that. She wanted to be as precise as she could be within the limits of her medium and her own ability, but she did know that they were going to be displayed, and she was an artist, and she had her own aesthetic sensibilities.
And pretty passionate about the Italian part of it and how it represented.
Right, exactly, absolutely. And so I'm sure that it was just an impossible thing for her to make. Impossible for any human being to make an absolute copy, absolutely accurate copy of anything else.
Didn't the Kelsey send a piece of the thing there so that you could compare them?
Yes. Last June I went to Pompeii. I've been going on short research trips there for a few years now. And there just seemed to be no way for me to make a comparison between the colors of the walls, which of course can't be removed because they're built right into the house, and the colors that Barroso chose. So I decided that I really needed to have a piece of that set of watercolors taken with me. I had to take a piece of it with me and just look at the two of them side by side. And it was very revealing. The Kelsey was very good about letting me take a piece. Actually, I didn't take it, they shipped it. And we had arranged a formal loan between the Kelsey Museum and the Superintendency of Pompeii, and the superintendent of Pompeii was extremely cooperative. He said, fine, I'll take charge of this for the time that you're here. And so I was able to take this piece to Italy, or send it to Italy, and then work with it in the room day after day. And it was remarkable, because when you look at Barroso's watercolor cycle in Ann Arbor, the colors look really, really bright. And when you go to Pompeii, because you're inside a darkened room, and these colors have been darkened over time with the wax treatment that they've received, they seem considerably duller. I mean, still very rich, but quite dull. And I thought, she just got them too bright, it just didn't look that way. But when I put them side by side, it was remarkable how close she came. And when the conservators at Pompeii cleaned a little of the wall for me, it was clear that she was seeing something brighter than what we see today. But her color scheme is really close, and it was very interesting for me to see how close she had come. She tried very, very hard to capture that color scheme.
Well, in the text you mentioned how the watercolor gave her more flexibility at trying to respond than other medium, I guess. But maybe I ought to explain about the medium that was used for the original in the wall.
Yeah, well, the medium is something like a fresco. But the Romans didn't do what we would today call a true fresco. It wouldn't be the same as Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, for example. Some parts of the walls seem to have been painted in that technique where the color with a water base is put on a damp plaster wall, and it actually sinks into the plaster and becomes part of the wall. Parts of the, say, the red backgrounds of these paintings are done in that way, or at least they appear to have bonded completely with the wall. But then the figures were partly painted over the red and partly on the unpainted wall, as far as I can tell from examining these very closely. And clearly they are not a true fresco, the kind of fresco that actually becomes part of the wall. And some of the paint, in fact, has chipped off over time. So we know that whatever binding medium they used, whatever either tempera or something analogous to that they used, didn't sink into the wall, but simply was very hard and adhered well, and certainly has survived, and survived a volcanic eruption and all of the heat that engendered. And but exactly what they used, I mean, I'm talking around your question a little bit because there's still a good bit of discussion in the scholarly and conservation communities about exactly how these things were made.
I guess what I was pointing at, that, you know, these issues of technique and methodology and all those things are also a way that's used to try to interpret originality and intent and who did what and how it was working.
Right. Well, I think in general, I think I would speak for the majority opinion in my field that these wall paintings were probably designed by the single master craftsman or artist, but would not have been painted only by one person. Would probably have been involved a workshop, and different levels of skill would have been required for different parts of the painting. If you were a beginner or someone who was just learning the trade, you probably got to do the red backgrounds, and then you progress to doing figures and hands and faces and feet and that kind of thing, depending upon your level of skill. No one has really determined how many artistic hands were at work in that particular set of wall paintings, but I think with close enough study you can discern differences among the figures.
But it is interesting that when it was found, there's pretty clear opinion that it was a major monument, major work of major quality.
Yes. Well, it's extremely impressive. There's no question about that. When you start looking at smaller details, you can begin to see some awkwardnesses in the way anatomy was handled, or sorts of things that you could get picky about and say, well, all right, the person who painted this wasn't really so good at doing feet or something like that. But in toto, it was just a major discovery because, first of all, they're almost life-size or even perhaps slightly larger than life-size figures on the walls. It's very unusual. You get very few paintings of this kind in antiquity, although we hear about them having been made through literary sources like Vitruvius, the architect who wrote the 10 books on architecture. But it was just different from everything that had been found at Pompeii up to that point, and in other areas, other towns around the Bay of Naples that were also buried by that eruption. So they were unusual, they were beautifully preserved, they were very expressive, the subject matter was literally mysterious, and immediately engaging. What people at the time were interested in really was trying to figure out what Greek paintings were like, because there was more interest in Greek art than there was in Roman, and Romans were thought primarily to be copyists and copying after the Greek model. So these were originally thought of as copies after a major Greek masterpiece that had not survived, but this was a very high quality replica in the opinion of many scholars. So that was part of the reason, too, why they became so famous and why they were admired from the start. There's a good deal of opinion that still favors that theory, but not everyone does anymore.
Well, and that phrase, a Roman copy after a Greek model, leads into the book. And,
That's right. It's a similar problem.
Yeah, the art of emulation, where it's not exactly a copy.
Right.
Always, it's. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that now.
This book, the title of the book, or the word emulation that we use in the book, and I say we because I worked on this book with a team of people that participated in a seminar in Rome in 1994. That term emulation really derives from the Latin emulatio. In the study, primarily the book focuses on sculpture rather than painting. There's one chapter on painting in the book. But the studies of sculpture for well over a century focused once again on this issue of the Roman copyist after some Greek masterpiece that is no longer preserved. And the kinds of sculptures that we were interested in this seminar and in the book, are what we might call today, or some scholars call today, ideal sculptures. They're not sculptures of emperors or sculptures of triumphal arches showing battle scenes or whatever, but they're sculptures of subjects that we might think of as ideal subjects. That is to say, gods and mythological figures and heroes and this sort of thing. And it was just that body of material that formed a kind of quarry for scholars who wanted to reconstruct the lost masterpieces of the Greeks. And so thousands and thousands of sculptures of this kind were treated as straightforward or maybe not quite accurate copies of these lost Greek masterpieces. The term emulatio began to be applied to the study of this kind of sculpture when some German scholars got interested in the parallels between literary studies and artistic studies, and applied terminology that the Romans themselves used for describing various kinds of imitatio, or we can't exactly translate that as imitation in English because it sounds pejorative, but to the Romans it was a kind of looking up to your models and emulating them, and trying to learn from them, but then even surpassing them. And emulation, in that sense of responding to the model but trying to surpass it, is what we were trying to study. How did that response, or what kind of response took place? And rather than looking at the relationship between the Roman product and the now lost Greek product as one of straightforward copying, or at least an attempt to copy whether or not you got it right, but to look at it as a more active process of being inspired by something that was considered a kind of paragon, something that was considered a fine example to follow and to learn from.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Enjoyed talking with you.